and I didn't know what it was. You know, I thought it was somebody that was hunting, had a goose blind, because it was a very shiny machine, and it was turning. It was about 15 inches off the ground, and you could see right underneath through it. And I thought to myself, I just wonder what the hell this could be. And you sure as heck, you couldn't walk up to it because you froze. I sat there, and I thought, well, gee whiz, you know, I kept looking at my time. It's getting later and later, and they wouldn't move. They just sat there. And every time I figured I should walk a little closer, I couldn't. I was just like, I was welded to the ground. They weren't standing stationary. I thought the machine was stationary, and it wasn't. It was going counterclockwise. The grass was going one way, and the machine was going the other way. So I walked a little closer. I wanted to really see what it was, but it was moving. And instinct told me to back up. So I backed up to stand about at least 15 feet away from him.
Let me tell you about one of Canada's most fascinating UFO cases that somehow flies under the radar. Back in late summer of 1974, something extraordinary went down in Saskatchewan, Canada. Now, while it might not be as famous as, say, the Roswell incident, this incident actually stands as one of North America's most credible UFO encounters. Here's what makes it so interesting. Even though only one person witnessed it that morning, they weren't just telling tall tales. What really sets this case apart is the physical evidence that was left behind. We're talking clear, distinct impressions in the field where these UFOs supposedly landed. Hi folks, I'm Johnny and welcome to The Oddest. Even now, 50 years later, nobody can explain what happened that day. I mean, countless UFO researchers have dug into this case and they're still scratching their heads. Sure, Canada's got its fair share of UFO stories, especially this part of Saskatchewan. But this one's different. Ask any local about the UFO incident at the farm and they'll know exactly what you're talking about. It's become legendary in those parts. But here's what really gets me. The witness, this guy, has told the story over and over for decades, and not one single detail has changed. Like, not one. And that's partly why both the witness and this case are still considered among the most credible close encounters we've ever documented. When experts talk about the most convincing UFO sightings in history, this one always makes the list.
And I thought to myself, well, that's kind of odd. It's going the opposite way. It's going counterclockwise. It's not going clockwise. It's going counterclockwise. Grass was moving one way and the machine was going the other way. And I thought, well, that's kind of weird. I thought, well, I wonder who the hell it is. Some joker probably playing a trick on me. And I was going to walk a little closer. Instinct told me to keep my distance. So I kept my distance and I walked around and looked at it. What the devil, there's another one on the other side. There were 3 in a row.
It's September 1st of 1974, a totally normal Sunday morning in rural Saskatchewan. Edwin Fuhr, a 36-year-old farmer, is going about his normal routine. Nothing special there, right? He has his breakfast with his dad around 7 AM, then he heads out to do, well, what farmers do, swath the fields. He's working near Langenburg, Saskatchewan, out on the east end of his property. Little did Edwin know that by 10:30 that very morning, he was about to experience something that would completely turn his world upside down, an encounter that would stick with him for the rest of his life. So there's Edwin, cruising along in his swather through the middle of his field, when something catches his eye up ahead. He spots these weird dome-shaped things. Now, being a practical type of guy, his first thought is, great, some jokers have set up duck blinds in my field. He figures someone's trying to mess with him, so he just keeps right on driving up towards them, not worried in the slightest. But hold up, something's not quite right here. The closer Edwin gets, the weirder things start to look. These aren't just regular old duck blinds. These domes, they're actually moving, like spinning in place. But the strange thing is, they're not even touching the ground, they're just hovering there, a few feet in the air. Now, I mean, that's definitely not something you see on your average morning on a farm in Saskatchewan. Now, things get really intense. Edwin stops his swather and steps down to get a better look. He's literally now 15 feet away from these things at this point. Up close, he can see that they're not just domes, and he can't really believe what he's looking at. These are flying saucers. We're talking classic UFO flying saucers here, hovering about a foot off the ground, spinning like crazy counterclockwise. The morning sun is hitting their surface just perfect, and these things are gleaming. We're talking mirror finish metallic, absolutely pristine. You know what's really wild though? Years later, Edwin described this amazing detail about how the grass underneath was moving in one direction while these crafts spun the opposite way. I mean, can you imagine actually witnessing something like that? At first, he actually moves even closer, but then his survival instinct kicks in, his fight or flight response. Something in his gut tells him, hang on here, buddy. Maybe we're getting a wee bit closer to these unknown flying objects. Maybe that's not the smartest idea. So he backs up, probably making one of the wisest decisions of his life. As he stepped back, he realised that there were 5 in total of these strange disc-shaped crafts. 3 were lined up directly in front of him, each roughly 30 feet wide, with 2 smaller ones positioned about 100 feet or so away on the either side. Feeling obviously uneasy, he returned to his wee swather machine and he sat there for a few moments, just trying to process the bizarre scene unfolding before him. That's when he noticed something odd. See, the engine, which he had left running, had completely shut off. When he tried to start it again, nothing happened. It was totally dead. Reflecting on this moment nearly 50 years later, he admitted, "The objects had me in a trance. I didn't know what to do." So he stayed in the cabin of the swather, mesmerised, just watching. Moments later, the crafts began to rise silently into the air. The 3 larger ones ascended first, followed by 2 smaller ones. As they climbed up to round about 100 feet above the ground, he noticed grey smoke or vapour streaming from the underneath of each craft. For the first time, he could clearly make out vents on the underside. Though he wasn't entirely sure why, he got the distinct impression that these vents, well, they played a pivotal role in how these crafts actually moved. Then, in an instant, they shot off into the sky at an incredible speed, vanishing within mere seconds. Now, more confused than ever, Fuhr stayed in the swather's cabin for several more minutes, waiting to make sure these strange objects wouldn't return. After a moment or two had passed, he cautiously stepped out of the swather and approached the slough's edge, where the crafts had been arranged in a clear half-moon semicircular formation. Reflecting on this later, he noted that it seemed like the 3 larger crafts in the centre were carrying out some kind of operation, while the 2 smaller ones on the edges appeared to be standing guard. As he inspected this area, he noticed the grass beneath where the crafts had hovered was flattened into a ring shape. The outer part of the ring was pressed down, but the grass in the middle, well, that still stood tall. This was a clear sign of the strange object's close proximity to the ground. With one final glance at the eerie scene, he returned to the swather and gave the engine another try. To his immense relief, it roared back to life. Wasting no time at all though, he climbed into the seat and headed straight back home. When he got back to the house, it didn't take long for his wife Karen and the rest of the family to realise that something was off. Karen would later recall how Edwin just sat there, silently, not saying a word, until she finally asked him what was wrong. That's when he opened up and recounted the bizarre events of the morning. Seeing how serious and shaken that he was, the family encouraged him to report what had happened. Later on that day, Royal Canadian Mounted Police Officer Ron Morier was notified of the sighting by Fuhr's brother-in-law Carol Zorn. Morier already knew Edwin and described him as the last person that you would expect to fabricate such a story. He remarked that Edwin was a quiet, reserved man, adding, "He's a responsible person and his information is considered reliable." The next day, the police officer visited the farm and examined the landing site firsthand. As he surveyed the scene, he couldn't help but be both intrigued and baffled. The impressions in the grass matched perfectly where Edwin said the objects had hovered, and there were no visible tracks or signs that anyone had walked or driven into that area to create these tracks. Reflecting on the incident many years later, Morier said, "Whatever made those impressions came from the sky and left the same way." Shortly after the cops' visit and the subsequent report, word of this encounter spread to the local and national media. Before long, the Fuhr's family farm in Langenburg became the centre of attention, drawing interest not only from reporters, but also from UFO enthusiasts and investigators. Fuhr later recalled that thousands of people flooded to the farm in the weeks and the months after the incident. The interest was so intense that cars stretched bumper to bumper from Langenburg all the way to the farm. For Edwin, the timing couldn't have been any worse because it was harvest season and he had work to do. He described how people were chasing us down in the middle of the field as they tried to get on with their work. Some even walked or drove right up to the combine or parked in their path. The constant disruption really frustrated Edwin, and his brother and father they were equally annoyed by all of the chaos. At one point, the situation escalated where a plane carrying tourists from Australia landed in a nearby field just to get a closer look at the site. It's clear that this kind of attention, it wasn't something that the Fuhr family wanted. As Officer Morier pointed out, why would he want thousands of people trampling all over his yard and fields? I mean, it hardly seemed like the actions of someone seeking personal gain. Eventually, beyond tired of attention, in the hopes of deterring future onlookers, Fuhr's father set the field where these objects had landed, he set them on fire. Despite this, however, the impressions of the objects still remained clearly visible, and the onlookers, they just continued to arrive. It wasn't just the crowds descending on the farm that were taking a toll on Edwin and his family. Their phone was ringing constantly with calls from people intrigued by this strange encounter. One call stood out more than the rest. This was a 2-hour conversation with Neil Armstrong, the first man to walk on the moon just 5 years earlier. During their chat, Armstrong not only discussed the objects that had landed on the farm, but also shared something remarkable. He told Edwin that during the Apollo 11 mission, they too had seen UFOs, but they were instructed by the powers that be not to talk about it publicly. This detail is fascinating. If we take Fuhr's account at face value, which most investigators of this case tend to do, then perhaps we should also consider his conversation with Armstrong as credible. If it is true, it could lend further weight to the theories about UFOs operating in near-Earth orbit, and even the idea of extraterrestrial bases on the moon. I mean, if it was Neil Armstrong, no, do you know what? That's fine. Despite growing tired of all the attention, Fuhr never turned anyone away, whether they showed up in person or called him on the phone. His only remark on this entire situation was, "You know how people are." Years later, during a television interview, Fuhr shared more details about the strange crafts that he had encountered up close. He described how the 3 larger objects each had a lip or a bumper around their base, resembling a metallic tyre encircling the bottom. Interestingly, this bumper was a dull grey, which was in stark contrast to the shiny silver metallic of the domed upper sections. Fuhr speculated that the grey colour was the result of extreme heat, as metal tends to dull and turn grey when it's exposed to very high temperatures. This intriguing detail has left some people to wonder if this bumper was a critical component of the craft's advanced propulsion system. Fuhr also recalled noticing details on the upper section of the crafts, which he compared to stainless steel or brushed aluminium. He pointed out rivets on the surface, and as the objects rotated, he could occasionally spot the bumps where these rivets were attached. The craft appeared to be made up of at least 2 distinct parts, a top and a bottom. Given that the bottom seemed to have become extremely hot, it's easy to imagine that the bottom section might have housed the propulsion system to move the crafts, while the top portion could have been where the cockpit was located. Another fascinating feature that he mentioned was the sight of 4 enormous pipes on the underside of each craft, positioned on the outer edges. Fuhr believed these pipes were responsible for leaving the impressions on the ground. In the days immediately following the encounter, it was discovered that the landing site showed elevated levels of radiation. This is a detail commonly associated with UFO sightings and landings, which only strengthens the credibility of Fuhr's account. What made it even stranger was that when an investigative team visited the site with several German Shepherd dogs, none of the dogs would go near the circular impressions. Curiously, when Fuhr tried to lead his cattle toward the same area, the animals reacted in much the same way, just point blank refusing to go anywhere near that area. An even more intriguing detail came to light around one of the objects, the one located to the left of the larger central craft. Fuhr noticed several triangular marks on the ground, as if something had opened and physically made contact with the earth. He recalled that the object had momentarily stopped spinning, and a tripod-like structure extended from the craft and onto the ground. What's particularly interesting though, is that the tripod's impression was found to be facing directly towards the Fuhr family home. Some researchers have speculated at this point that this might suggest that the craft's occupants were observing the house, possibly as part of some sort of surveillance operation. In addition to describing the crafts, Fuhr also shared how the encounter affected him emotionally. He explained that his mind was overwhelmed with so many thoughts, all trying to make sense of the situation, but the bizarre and surreal nature of what he was experiencing left him unable to process it all fully. He was also very honest about the fear that he felt, admitting that he was scared stiff. He went on to say, "There were 5 of them and only 1 of me." To illustrate just how terrified he was, he said, "If someone had clapped their hands, I would likely have dropped dead right there. I was that scared." It's worth considering how Fuhr described his instinct telling him to back away from the objects when he was thinking about getting closer. Was this just a natural human gut reaction, or could there have been something more at play here? Perhaps the intelligence inside the craft was somehow communicating telepathically, reaching into his subconscious and warning him, don't get any closer. I mean, in previous videos we've discussed this telepathic link between these alien visitors and us. Was it maybe trying to protect the occupants of the craft? Or was it guiding Fuhr for his own safety? Fuhr himself mentioned that he felt something in the back of his mind telling me to keep my distance. More concerning, however, were the physical effects that he experienced after the encounter. Fuhr recalled that his bones and joints ached for weeks, and he would often feel what he described as electric shocks running through his joints at random moments. This could have been due to the heightened radiation levels, or perhaps it was a side effect of some unknown technology. Additionally, Fuhr discovered that the cattle on the neighbouring farm had become suddenly spooked around the same time as the sighting. The animals were so shaken that they broke through the fence and ran around, bellowing anxiously. While it may seem like a minor detail, this animal behaviour adds further evidence that something truly unusual was in the area that September morning. Ultimately, Fuhr described the whole encounter as mind-boggling. Really mind-boggling. As compelling as Fuhr's account may seem, it's natural that some people question what actually happened that day. However, it's more important to note that it isn't just the story of a single individual making wild claims. There was physical evidence left behind in the form of these ring-shaped impressions in the grass, which does add a level of credibility to the entire situation. Additionally, Royal Canadian Mounted Police Officer Ron Morier, who investigated the case, was absolutely certain that Fuhr was being honest and truthful in his description of these events. Morier himself had an impeccable career, eventually becoming an expert in reconstructing facial features for missing persons and unidentified bodies. Well, I mean, he just brings an added layer of credibility to his assessment of Fuhr's account. His judgment is especially significant given his own reputation and expertise. What's even more fascinating is that Fuhr's account didn't just attract attention from UFO investigators and enthusiasts. It also caught the interest of both the Canadian and United States Air Forces. No surprise there. Fuhr later recalled that on several occasions he saw aircraft flying low over the field from various angles, clearly taking aerial photographs of the site. He also mentioned witnessing helicopters hovering at low altitudes overhead, possibly conducting similar operations or some kind of covert surveillance mission. I mean, we have to wonder if there was nothing significant to this incident. Why did both the Canadian and US Air Forces show so much interest? Whether they suspected the objects were extraterrestrial or not, they certainly thought enough of the situation to document it with aerial photos and potentially run their own tests over the landing site. One can only speculate what the official files from these aerial missions might reveal about this case. In the years after the incident, Fuhr continued to run the family farm as normal. While the initial buzz around the case faded somewhat, he still received regular requests for interviews. These came from UFO enthusiasts, as well as radio and television stations that wanted to feature his encounter in their programmes. It's worth noting, however, that despite his willingness to talk about the strange events that occurred half a century ago, Fuhr never once profited from the experience. The only payment that he received for sharing his story was a complimentary breakfast from CTV when he visited their studio for an interview. Fuhr eventually retired from farming in 1989, choosing carpentry in his later years to keep his mind active and engaged. He also developed a continued interest in UFOs after the incident, enjoying reading books on the subject and sometimes coming across retellings of his own account. Ron Morier also maintained a strong interest in UFOs, particularly the encounter with Edwin Fuhr. He kept an extensive file which included the original report and various press clippings from over the years. Like Fuhr, he was often approached by UFO groups or television networks. While he hasn't been as eager to discuss the incident as Fuhr, he does speak about it from time to time. And just like Fuhr, he remains firmly convinced that Fuhr saw exactly what he claimed. Whether those objects came from another world or had a more earthly origin, well, that remains a mystery.
If someone tells you, I don't believe you, like what?
Well, I says, I wish you don't. I says, why are you bothering me if you don't believe it? Because if you're bothering me, you must be believing it. And they don't say too much. They just, get all red in the face. So I don't know. It doesn't bother me.
The mystery surrounding the event continues to endure, with its complexity and unanswered questions giving rise to new theories and interpretations each time it's revisited. Whether these explanations will remain just theories, or if concrete evidence will one day surface to answer these questions definitively, is uncertain. But Fuhr's account remains one of the most enduring in the UFO phenomenon. Well, that's it for yet another video, folks. As always, I want to express my gratitude to you for taking the time to watch me ramble on. Please, stay safe out there, tell someone you love them, and remember, no matter what, keep smiling.